Siamo tutti curiosi di ascoltare questo intervento dal titolo molto suggestivo, quindi invito chi ne avesse bisogno e non vuole perdersi una parola di questo intervento a recuperare le cuffie per la traduzione. Matt è banker, è laureato in storia, ha una passione profonda per l'archeologia e l'alto medioevo, coltivata sin da bambino, che lo ha portato proprio a intraprendere questi approfondimenti a livello di ricostruzione storica, ed è coautore assieme a Paul Mortimer di questo libro molto interessante uscito da poco sulle spade, che ho avuto modo di guardare ieri sera e devo dire che è eccezionale, quindi complimenti a entrambi gli autori. Qui si vede appunto anche in questo caso l'esperienza della ricostruzione, l'esperienza tecnologica e tecnica sui materiali applicata all'archeologia. Lo lasciamo qui per chi volesse consultarlo.
Shameless plug. Thank you, Andrew. This one? Oh, awesome.
Prego.
Okay, firstly, before I begin, ladies and gentlemen, just a huge thank you for all the organisers of this event for inviting myself and my colleagues from Wulfednas to take part in this wonderful celebration of early medieval history and culture. So, Enta geweorc. An overview of repurposing, reuse and recycling in the early Anglo-Saxon period. The phrase that I use in the title of this paper, Enta geweorc, appears in the Old English poem The Ruin. And it's a poem that evokes the former glory of a Roman city by contrasting it with its decayed state. The phrase literally means giant's work, which is a poetic allusion to the skill of the imperial craftsmen who left the landscape of post-Roman Britain littered with countless buildings, and I feel that it is in a small way pertinent to the following discussion, in which it will become clear that those involved in the creation of material objects in the early centuries of Anglo-Saxon England were very much dependent on the work of those that came before them. However, this phrase, Enta geweorc, perhaps gives a misleading impression as to the way in which the people of Anglo-Saxon England perceived those who came before them. I'll say briefly that although it is an Old English phrase, and a language that we think of as being Anglo-Saxon, it is becoming increasingly problematic to think in terms of Anglo-Saxons in the context of post-Roman early medieval Britain. As more and more evidence emerges from DNA, strontium isotope analysis, the more it becomes obvious that the old theories of population displacement in the 5th century are flawed, and that in many, if not all areas, the population was a mixed one. However, the culture which developed was distinct from that which existed at the end of imperial control in the early 5th century. And perhaps in another year we can discuss the difficult issue of ethnicity as opposed to cultural identity in early medieval Europe. So, what I want to discuss today is the evidence that we have for repurposing, recycling and reuse of Roman materials specifically in Britain in the opening centuries of the early medieval period. Some background. At its peak, the Roman Empire was producing an estimated 100,000 metric tons of lead, 82,000 tons of iron, and 15,000 tons of copper alloys every year. And in Britain alone, a study of smelting sites allows us to estimate that somewhere in the region of 2,250 tons of iron were being smelted. These levels of industrial activity would not be reached again until the early modern era, and they required a huge degree of organisation across a wide variety of activities, and the upheavals of the 4th century led to the disruption of this organised activity in late Roman Britain. And archaeology shows us that beginning in the late 4th century, as the Romano-British economy began to falter, the production and availability of fresh materials also faltered and then effectively failed. And certainly by the start of what we think of as the start of the Anglo-Saxon period in the mid-5th century, we find little evidence for the large-scale production of fresh raw materials. On the continent, in sites in France, Italy, Germany, the Netherlands and even Scandinavia, we have good evidence for relatively large-scale smelting operations in the 5th and 6th century, something that seems to be entirely absent in Britain. And yet the production of new objects did not cease. We know that the working of iron, copper alloy, lead and glass continued, so where did the materials come from that allowed the creation of these objects to continue? Now, the obvious answer would seem to be that existing objects were scavenged and recycled from the largely abandoned towns, fabricae, forts, villas, temples, complexes that littered the early medieval landscape of post-Roman Britain, as these sites would have contained many tons of usable material. The fabric of the buildings themselves would have been a good source, with iron clamps, as we see here, being used to hold walls together and to hold the marble facades to the exteriors of the buildings. The fittings of these buildings would also be targets for plunder. Door handles, hinges, lead gutters, water pipes, window glass, even down to the nails. So if our assumption is that the decline in production of raw materials necessitated the scavenging and recycling of them, what evidence can we find to support this assumption? Now, firstly, at the most basic level, there is just the general absence of such materials in the remains of Roman sites when they are excavated. At a site, Little Oakley in Essex, excavations showed that substantial timber buildings that were erected in the late 4th century on the site of 2 large 2nd century villas seem to have been stripped entirely of all their associated metal materials, right down to the nails, either during their deconstruction in the later 5th century or after their collapse. And we can perhaps imagine a scene such as that described by Gregory of Tours in his Historiae, whilst relating an incident in which a house was destroyed. Gregory writes, "Rocolinus tore down the house itself, which had been built with nails, and the people of Mans, who had come on that occasion with him, carried the nails off, filling their bags." I'm sure they weren't hoarding these nails as mementos of the destruction, so we can only assume that nails were worth salvaging. And we find this same lack of evidence at other Roman sites. At the famous bathing complex of Aquasulis, now Bath in Somerset, the metalwork which held the massive monumental stone walls together was removed at some time in the late 5th or early 6th century, leading to the eventual collapse of the walls. And we know that this occurred prior to the collapse because even the stones at the bottom of the piles of remains were found to have had their clamps removed when excavated. And this pattern is repeated at most Roman sites of any size across Britain. The vast quantities of recyclable materials which form part of the fabric of these structures are usually absent. Later in the Anglo-Saxon period, we find the building materials themselves, dressed stones and tiles, being removed and reused to create new buildings. But as that is a practice that only seems to start to occur in the later 7th century, we won't be going into that today. And then beyond this general absence, we also have tangible evidence. We have examples of hoards, which include scrap Roman metalwork. Some of that metalwork contains the legacy marks of having been cut free from the buildings that they once held together. Other hoards, made up of easily portable items rather than architectural salvage, are also found, like this collection of old iron saw blades, nails, and other ferrous and lead scrap, which comes from a site at Icklingham in Essex. And Icklingham's an interesting site because it serves as an excellent example of a transition. There is a centuries-long tradition of working freshly smelted material at Icklingham, which gives way in the late 4th century to working of scavenged iron, which continues into the 5th century. We also have evidence of these scavenged materials being recycled. I've gone the wrong way. Here we go. One of the Anglo-Saxon Grubenhausen at Mucking had been used for lead casting, with large lumps of lead spelter found on the floor of the house. Now, given the nearest known lead mine is some 170 miles away at Charterhouse in Somerset, the assumption has to be that this material was being scavenged and recycled from the large villa complex which was found nearby. 28 cast lead rings of this sort were found in various locations in the settlement at Mucking. They're usually interpreted as being loom weights, although the archaeologist Helena Hamerow has suggested that they're actually ingots rather than weights. But there's no evidence of them in the known lead-producing areas in Britain, so if they are ingots, they don't seem to have been part in any trade in fresh raw materials. These examples are from Abingdon in Oxfordshire, which is closer to the lead mines at Charterhouse in Somerset, but it's still 85 miles away. And other examples have been found in Kent, Middlesex, Suffolk and Essex, and none of these have known lead deposits which were being exploited in the Roman or early medieval period. So again, we're assuming that this is lead material that is being recycled from nearby Roman structures. Now, whatever their purpose at Mucking, as at other sites, their location in the settlement indicates that they were made in the earlier phase of habitation. in the 5th and 6th century, and their absence from later contexts perhaps points towards the supply of recyclable Roman material being exhausted by the later 6th century. And this is a pattern that we see being repeated in the recycling of other materials, most notably with copper alloys and glass. Although in the case of the latter, studies of the chemical composition of items found in early Anglo-Saxon contexts have shown that the choice between using recycled glass or previously unused raw materials seems to be dependent on the objects being made. An analysis of the composition of Anglo-Saxon beads from RAF Lakenheath in Suffolk has shown that the manufacture of beads in England during the early Anglo-Saxon period seems to have been almost entirely dependent on the use of recycled Roman glass, whereas beads found in burials of that period that we think are being imported from the continent are being made using fresh material, fresh raw material. Now that's not to say that continental beads aren't also being made from recycled glass, but we don't see much evidence of those being imported into the country. The imports seem to be these higher quality, finer quality imports made using raw materials. And we do find that collections of fragments of Roman glass recovered from several early Anglo-Saxon sites are being curated, collected together from different objects in a way which can only really be explained if the glass is being scavenged in preparation for recycling. Now, in contrast to the beads, when we look at studies of the drinking vessels of the mid-5th century and 6th century, the glass is free from recycled material and is similar in chemical content to that used in the late Roman period. The raw material seems to be coming from the same sources in the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean, and indeed it may actually have been old stocks of raw materials that were being used to make these vessels. When we look at the vessels that are being made in the 7th century, they're still using this raw material, this purer material, but we start to see the introduction of wood ash and some recycled materials, presumably to compensate for a scarcity in the unadulterated material as a result again of either the exhaustion of old stocks or possibly a disruption in the import of the raw material. Now, we have no such apparent distinction or selection when we study copper alloy objects. The composition of copper alloys used to make objects in the late 5th century through to the late 6th and early 7th century shows that nearly all objects manufactured during the period contain recycled materials across all types and regions of Anglo-Saxon Britain. It also shows that objects were continuously recycled through this period, with alloys of the 5th century being closer to the types of pure alloys produced in the Roman period compared to those used in the 6th century, which seem to show a blending of these different alloy types, as we'd expect if different materials were just being gathered together and smelted together to produce new objects. And we see a change in alloy composition in objects dated to the later 7th century, where we start to see new alloys being produced, again perhaps indicating that, as with the other materials, the supply of readily available Roman copper alloy objects was near exhaustion. Now, whilst the use of recycled copper alloy would have had little effect upon the quality of the objects being produced, the same cannot be said for recycled iron. Old iron, when reworked in the forge, has different properties to iron which has been freshly smelted. One of the most important differences being the difficulty in introducing carbon into old iron to produce the sort of harder, steelier irons required to make cutting edges which need to be applied to the softer iron to make swords, knives and other objects. And studies of spearheads and knives from early Anglo-Saxon contexts have shown that in some cases the quality of the iron being used was very poor, with no evidence of any steelier iron being used in their manufacture. And this may indicate that in some areas of the country or in some communities, recycled Roman iron was the only material available, and it's being used to make objects for which it's not really suited on its own. And we even find examples where knives have been forged using a mix of low and high carbon content recycled iron, but in such a way that it's clear that the smith had no idea that he was using alloys with different properties, merely forge welding scrap iron together to make a single bar and then forming a blade from that. And I could at this point start to talk about swords, the complexity of their construction and the importance of the qualities of the iron used in their production, but I will refrain, as the subject of iron used in the manufacture of swords is one which my colleague, Paul Mortimer, sat over there at the back, is much more knowledgeable, better able to speak. What I would say instead, and I hope I've translated this correctly, Perhaps you'd care to buy a copy of a book on which we have both worked on for a number of years. Iron objects are ubiquitous in Anglo-Saxon burials, with small domestic knives being one of the most commonly found objects. So there was clearly no shortage of Roman material to recycle, and the stripping of sites for their reusable materials must have been an everyday activity for some people in these early Anglo-Saxon communities. And obviously this process of scavenging abandoned Roman materials would of course yield more than just scrap. Personal objects that were originally manufactured during the imperial period are frequent finds in Anglo-Saxon contexts, particularly in early Anglo-Saxon burials of the 6th and 7th centuries. And in some cases, these are whole objects, unaltered and clearly still functional, several centuries after they're first made. In other cases, we find elements of Roman objects being incorporated into new objects of seemingly local manufacture. The presence of so much Roman material in Kentish cemeteries led the 18th century antiquarian Brian Fawcett to conclude that he was actually excavating the graves of Romanised Britons. Subsequently, it was recognised that the objects were, in the majority of cases, ancient at the time of deposition in these burials, and that their presence couldn't be taken as an indication of the ethnicity of the person in the burial. And the fact that they're always found in burials which are otherwise entirely Anglo-Saxon in nature, both in terms of the forms of the burial and also the nature of the other objects, clearly indicates that the burials which feature these objects are not, as Fawcett first thought, the burials of some part of the population who maintained a distinctly Romano-British material culture in an otherwise materially Germanic environment. Of the intact Roman objects found in Anglo-Saxon burials, which include brooches, rings, bracelets, belts, fittings, pins, beads, the most numerous by far are brooches. Of these, the oldest form are the Nauheim brooches, a style of brooch in use in the early 1st century, of which there are at least 15 examples known from Anglo-Saxon contexts. Now, some of these are fragmentary, and their role as grave goods is unclear, but others are intact and when being worn as functional brooches in the 6th century. Or we assume that they were being worn in life. It would perhaps be odd to bury somebody wearing brooches that they didn't use during their life. But again, the subject of how material objects in burials are indicators of use in life is too long a discussion to go into in this session. Suffice to say, it must always be borne in mind that the objects buried with the dead were put there by the living for reasons which may not be obvious to us today. So these are two brooches from two different burials in early Anglo-Saxon Andover in Hampshire. Both were intact when found, and their position in the graves shows that they were being used for their original purpose, as one of a pair which served to close a peplos-style dress. Now, interestingly, in each case, the other brooch in the set was very different. In one case, it was a simple Anglo-Saxon disc brooch. The other was a quoit brooch. These two burials date to the late 5th century and early 6th centuries, which means that these brooches were seemingly being used functionally more than 400 years after they were first made. We also have belt fittings in Anglo-Saxon burials. We do sometimes find isolated examples of 2nd or 3rd century belt fittings, but those found in early Anglo-Saxon graves usually originate in the early to mid 4th century. These range from the narrow type with the animal heads on a long belt plate, as you can see in the top left, to the wide belt sets associated with late Roman military. And as with the Nauheim brooches, the majority of these buckles are found in late 5th, early 6th century burials. There's a roughly even split between male and female burials. And again, their position in the graves shows that they are being worn 150 years or more after they're being manufactured. Other items found in early Anglo-Saxon burials appear to be substantially unaltered, but are clearly no longer serving the purpose for which they're first created. We have a nice example of a small copper alloy tag stamped with the number 14 in Roman numerals from a cremation burial in Alton in Hampshire. It's assumed to be a theatre ticket, and we have absolutely no idea why the object was being kept and was important enough to be put into the cremation urn rather than just being recycled as scrap material. I tried to get a photo of it because it's a lovely little thing, but unfortunately it's not on display at the moment. But it's an interesting example of an object that's ancient and carefully curated, carefully looked after for some reason that we don't necessarily understand. It is well known that many female early Anglo-Saxon burials feature complexes of disparate small objects, broken beads, broken copper alloy objects that are being kept in pouches for no seemingly practical purpose, Perhaps they're simply collections of scrap objects gathered while scavenging and saved with a view to recycling, but then why bury them? Why do they end up in the grave? It has been suggested that they are collections of objects thought to have some talismanic or mystical properties. Roman coins are frequent finds in these pouches, and it has been suggested that the portraits and figures depicted on them were somehow taken to be those of gods, making them objects of veneration or at least of religious significance. However, given that we also find Roman coins being used as weights in early Anglo-Saxon contexts, the truth may be rather more prosaic. Sometimes they were merely attractive or interesting objects. Coins are also being worn on necklaces, usually just pierced to allow suspension, as you can see with this example here from Andover. But sometimes the coins are taken and incorporated into newly made mounts. We see this with this beautiful piece here from Forsbrook. This is the Forsbrook pendant. This is a late 4th century gold solidus of Valentinian II, incorporated into a cloisonné mount in the late 6th or early 7th century. Incidentally, whilst most of the insets here are garnet, some are glass, and analysis has shown that the glass used was recycled Roman material. Now, as well as being used in unaltered forms, we find Roman objects being recycled and incorporated into new objects. In some cases, the Roman element is a partial fragment of the original. This buckle from Blacknell is from a female grave, say Blacknell Field in Wiltshire, and what we can see is a small piece of a larger 4th century belt mount with a distinctive chip-carved decoration. It has been used to create a new decorative plate for a new buckle. In other examples, we find that the part itself has been incorporated wholly into new objects. Two excellent examples of these both utilise the same type of object, an intaglio, but the object types themselves are very different. Firstly, we have this, a great square-headed brooch found in the burial of a woman at an Anglo-Saxon cemetery near Alveston Manor in Warwickshire. The brooch is dated to the 2nd or 3rd quarter of the 6th century, and it's notable not just for its size, which at 18 centimetres by 9 centimetres is exceptional, but also because it has the intaglio set into it. Now, while some forms of this brooch do feature inlays in the forms of garnet or glass, this is the only one that I can think of in an Anglo-Saxon context which has a Roman intaglio set into it. And I'm sorry that it's hard to make out, but the intaglio itself shows a figure, possibly Cupid, milking a goat. Secondly, we have this, a large gold ring found in a boat burial at Snape in Suffolk. The burial is dated to the mid-6th century. And this ring is set with an intaglio which depicts a bonus of Entus. The ring itself is decorated with the sort of beaded wire and granular work that is typical of 6th and 7th century Germanic jewellery. And Rupert Bruce Mitford considered the ring to be of Anglo-Saxon workmanship. And there's certainly nothing about the style of decoration that precludes that from being the case. But William Filmer Sankey thought it was more likely to be of continental Germanic origin, drawing parallels between it and other examples found on the continent, most notably a ring from the great Frankish burial field at Krefeld-Gelab. Early medieval rings featuring intaglios are seemingly absent from 5th century contexts. There doesn't appear to be any obvious continuity of use between the late Roman and early medieval periods. We do have this gap. The earliest continental example seems to be one in a grave in Saint-Denis in France, female burial from the 2nd quarter of the 6th century. There is a suggestion that the trend began not so much as a desire to ape late Roman fashion, but to start aping a Byzantine fashion by the Franks, and then by extension to the people of southeastern Britain, who themselves seem to take on aspects of Frankish fashion at the time. But the Alveston brooch does show us that Anglo-Saxon craftsmen were incorporating these stones into high-status objects in ways which have no parallels either on the continent nor in the Eastern Empire. So, whilst they may well have selected their intaglios for more reasons than their aesthetic qualities, it seems unwise to assume that in doing so they are simply aping a Byzantine fashion. Rather than it being a simply aesthetic choice, there is the possibility that just as the stones themselves were recycled, the imagery that they bore was also recycled into new meaning. It's often stated that the Germanic users of these Roman intaglios had no idea of the meaning of the figures, and that's probably true in the strictest sense. The significance of Bonus Aventus or Apollo or any other kind of Roman god or deity was no doubt lost on the wearers of such rings, but it does not follow from that the Germanic wearers selected the stones just for their decorative qualities or for some magical quality. It has been argued that the attribution of new meanings to old monuments was an important way for a new elite to legitimise its position, and there's no reason why on a smaller scale the same process may not have taken place, with Germanic people investing the figures on the intaglios with their own meanings. We do know in the later medieval period, images created in the Roman period were being interpreted in completely different ways to their original meanings. We have the example of the great cameo of St. Albans, which doesn't survive, but what we do have is this drawing from Matthew Paris. Originally, we think that the cameo featured an emperor or Jupiter holding a scepter in one hand, holding Minerva in the other, and with Jupiter's eagle at his feet. But by the 13th century, we have Matthew Paris's drawing and also a description, and we know that at the time it was being interpreted in a very different manner. The god figure or the emperor figure was now described as a distressed person, and the scepter has become a spear, and Minerva is now described as being a clothed boy, and the whole item has become associated with childbirth, and their belief had developed that passing the stone over a pregnant mother would induce labour and ease birth. So presented with such carefully and skillfully executed figures, it doesn't seem unreasonable to assume that the early medieval Germanic people would create their own interpretations of the intaglio scenes. And what these meanings might have been is impossible to say, but then it's impossible for us to say what a lot of iconography of the period means. You think of the Pressbleck images on the helmets and other items of early medieval material culture. We don't know what the stories are, but it doesn't seem unreasonable to know that at the time people understood those stories. They would understand the iconography and what it represented. And that these intaglios did have specific meanings, or the figures on them did have specific meanings, is perhaps indicated by the types of scenes that are being chosen for settings. A study carried out by Phil Masanki showed that standing and seated figures accounted for 70% of the types selected in Western Germanic contents for reuse, which is a much higher proportion than would be achieved if the stones were just being chosen at random. This is only a feature of the intaglio rings from Western European contexts. We don't get the same kind of differentiation in Lombardic contexts. So does the figure chosen represent power? Potentially. The rings are certainly high-status objects. Given the seeming care chosen in choosing the subject matter, the assumption has to be that it was important. And we can perhaps consider the Alveston brooch in the same way. Was the choice of a scene, a figure milking a goat, specifically chosen for use in a female gendered object because it had a specific relevance to the role of that gender in early Anglo-Saxon society? So, what conclusions can we draw from these disparate strands of evidence? Why were the people of early medieval Britain such keen recyclers of Roman material? And it's tempting to think that the most obvious answer is necessity, but I think it is more nuanced than that. As you said earlier, it's certainly true that the levels of raw material production achieved during the imperial period could not be sustained in the decades and centuries which followed, but that doesn't preclude a return to the model of extensive smaller-scale smelting activities which took place during the Iron Age in Britain. The difference between the pre- and post-Roman period is the availability of materials to recycle. Perhaps it's not that they were unable to produce their own raw materials after the collapse of that large-scale Roman activity. They simply didn't have to due to the great abundance of material just waiting to be salvaged and recycled. Now, this may, of course, eventually have led to a loss of skills in those areas necessary in the sourcing and production of new raw materials in subsequent decades, so that when the recyclable material does start to become more difficult to resource, the skills have to be reintroduced, regenerated. That does seem to be what starts to occur in the 7th century, but then that coincides with the rise of more unified, organised and wealthy centres of power than we find in the earlier period, and that they may have been able to pay to import both new supplies of raw materials and also the skills necessary to regenerate that local production. So when it comes to the reasons for the reuse of objects, there are several possibilities to consider. Some of the objects are just aesthetically appealing as well as being functional. So which of either was the more important consideration? When we think of the use of brooches, then obviously there's the functionality to consider, but does that in itself warrant the use of a 400-year-old brooch over a newer one? Particularly as they only seem to be used in conjunction with a distinctly Anglo-Saxon style brooch as part of a pair. Perhaps that in itself is significant. Does the pairing of a Roman artifact with a Germanic one suggest that either the deceased person or their descendants wanted to show a connection to both cultures? Possibly, but then why choose an object of such great age over a 4th century one, which is what we see with the use of belt fittings? It has also been suggested that the use of Roman objects was an attempt to legitimise the authority of developing Anglo-Saxon elites, taking on the trappings of the previous rulers. But then if that were the case, we might expect the practice to be more widespread, or to have created a market for replica items. Perhaps the use of intaglios is one example where the use of a Roman object might have something to do with making a connection with the past, what's making a statement about power and authority. And the use of late Roman military belt components, as seen at mucking, may also be a connection to the authority of the previous wearer, or may even have been used as a badge of rank or status. But I don't think that the same can be said when considering the use of an extremely worn late 4th century buckle in an otherwise typically mid-status Anglo-Saxon burial. Obviously, the truth is that there isn't one neat, tidy explanation. Some objects were probably used as symbols of power and status, either because of associations with other cultures or because of new meanings with which they'd been imbued, relevant to the new culture. Some objects may have been kept because they were thought to be talismanic, with their symbolic value outweighing their material worth of scrap, and sometimes somebody just thought they were pretty. Like most things to do with the early medieval period in Britain, the lack of anything other than archaeological evidence means that for the most part, all we can do is theorise. One last thing to consider then. As stated earlier, the stripping of Roman sites of their raw materials and the sifting through abandoned houses for desirable objects must have been an everyday activity in the early Anglo-Saxon period. It may be that the recovery of materials for recycling was the primary purpose, and that the discovery of desirable artefacts was a byproduct of that. It is, however, possible that scouring old sites for reusable objects was thought to be an equally worthy activity. And if that's the case, then what did the people make of these sites? Did they have any awareness as to who built them, who lived there and left these objects behind? Did they really consider them to be some race of mystical titans? The British monk Gildas, writing in the early 6th century, was certainly aware that the Romans had built the towns, cities and walls that were becoming ruins in his time. Later, at the end of the 7th century, in his book on the life of St. Cuthbert, Bede tells us that Cuthbert was taken to see the walls of the town and the remarkable fountain formerly built by the Romans when he was visiting Carlisle. Slightly later, in the 8th century, Alcuin begins his poem on the bishops, kings and saints of York with the word, "York with its high walls and lofty towers was first built by Roman hands." There can be no doubt that the understanding that these were the works of mortal men was never lost, although how far down through society that understanding was maintained is unknowable. There is a traditional view that the people we think of as Anglo-Saxons avoided making these settlements in the old villas, towns and cities of Roman Britain because they feared them, thinking them to be Enta geweorc, the work of giants. But perhaps the truth is that there was no fear, no superstition, no notion that these places were the work of some mythical beings. Rather, they just avoided living in them because they saw them primarily as resources to be exploited, and would no more live in them than they would live in a quarry or a mine or a rubbish heap. Grazie mille. Oh. Thank you.
Grazie Matt, bellissima conclusione direi di queste 2 giornate dedicate all'impiego, perché riassume tutte le complessità di questa pratica e quindi tutte le complessità dei significati che stanno dietro a questa pratica, quindi bisogno, convenienza, ma anche un forte potere ideologico che sta, di status, che sta dietro il reimpiego di questi oggetti, quindi è una conclusione perfetta, direi.